Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming out. I'm Bryan Post, and I'm going to talk to you about stress this evening and see if we can't share some very valuable things that can be very useful for you. My 15 years prior to being here at Project Wellness was spent traveling the world working with families and children who struggled with relationship and behavior issues, primarily trauma. So all my background for 15 years is in the study of trauma and neuroscience and how stress affects your brain and how it affects your body. And so when I came here, doing that for 15 years and working with families for that long is pretty intense. So when I came here, I was actually hoping to move away from it a little bit. And so as I'm talking to all of our other resident gurus, one day in particular, I was talking to Chef Robin, and she was telling me about how food is everything. You gotta eat the right food, because if you eat the right food, it changes your body and it changes your brain. And as she's talking, I'm thinking, I feel that same way about stress. And then I'm talking to Dr. Tammy, and she said, hormones is everything. If you get your hormones right, everything. And I'm like, I feel that same way about stress. And then Scott goes through his transformation, and he's like, oh my gosh, yoga is everything. Yoga saves lives. And I'm like, I feel that same way about stress. And so then I'm thinking, the reality is we have all these people here at Project Wellness who are really passionate about what they do. And they have a real expertise in what they do. And that's why we call it the 5 pillars. So if you think about all the pillars, subtracting detox, which is a very important one, but we have people who have a lot of expertise in all of the very important areas. And so I want to share with you this evening kind of my expertise in stress, and I believe that it can be very helpful for you in understanding and helping you to look at all the other pillars that you are dealing with as you work towards wellness and health. So I'm going to start off by introducing you to my little friend right here. It's a very important little friend. I met him about 12 years ago in San Diego. I had been seeing these different little mindfulness bowls, music bowls, meditation bowls, and I wanted one because I thought, they make a nice little sound. And so I was lecturing to a group in San Diego about 12 years ago, and I said, does anyone know because you're in California, right? You should be able to find something like this. So I said, does anyone know where I can find one of those little bowls you hit? And a lady raised her hand, and she said, yeah, my husband makes them. And so after my presentation that evening, she brought this over as a gift. Her husband had made this for me, and so I have cherished it since. But it's got two purposes. Number one, I always tell my audience when I'm lecturing, because usually I lecture for a whole day. I'm going to try to keep this down to 1 hour, maybe a little longer. I always tell them it's a cue to let you know when after we take a break that we're going to start back. So I'm not one of those people who says, all right, we're going to get started. I just like to ring the bowl and let you know we're going to start. But number two, and most importantly, when you hear the bowl, it is a cue to take 3 deep breaths. Inhaling through your nose and exhaling out of your mouth. And so what I like to do is to give my audience an opportunity to practice their breathing. So let's try that. Just inhale through your nose, out of your mouth for 3 times. Very nice. Now here's why I share that with you. Because it is the single most important thing that I can teach you. Breathing. Number one, if you're not breathing, you're dead. But number two, breathing is the one proven way to interrupt your stress physiology. And the moment we become stressed, the first thing we do is we stop breathing. And as soon as you stop breathing, your stress starts to increase. As your stress starts to increase, one very important thing happens to your thinking process. There's a neuroscientist, his name is Joseph Ledoux, he's from New York University, and he says, in times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted and suppresses our short-term memory. In times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted. So when you become stressed, you're no longer thinking clearly. And your short-term memory shuts off. So think about the last time you had an argument with someone. The last time you got upset with someone about something. Think about 5 minutes prior. 5 minutes prior, everything was okay. Could have been the most loving person in the world. Your soulmate, the person you want to spend the rest of your life with. You want to go on vacation with. And 5 minutes later, you want to kill them. You're ready to choke them. You want to hit them over the head with a pan. You want to push them out of the car while you're driving along. Confused and distorted thinking. Short-term memory gets suppressed. One of the primary things that happens when we stop breathing. So when you can remember to breathe, it will make you more able and more capable to be in the present moment. So I always say to people, practice your breathing not when you're stressed. Practice it while you're calm. Practice it while you're driving along. Practice it while you're laying in bed. Practice it while you're watching TV. Practice it while you're standing in line at the grocery store. Make it a habit, because it's not an easy habit. Because when stress sets in, the first thing our body wants to do is shut all that off. And so when you can start practicing it, it'll take you a long ways, especially when you're walking through the grocery store and you're hungry and you want to make bad decisions. So, Our Deepest Fear by Marianne Williamson. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It is not just in some of us, it is in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. One of my favorite little quotes. And it really lays the foundation for the things that I talk about this evening as it relates to stress. So I want you to ask yourself this question: can you live at a higher level of consciousness? Many of you came here for the physical because you wanted to feel better, you wanted to look better, but there are many levels to who we are. One is emotional. It is our ability to love, is our ability to react to fear. It's our spiritual connections, our psychological, our thinking, and then our financial. In order to optimize one, we have to incorporate all of them. So it's not just about the physical that's important. And this evening we'll be talking about these other things. So I'd like to start with this little depiction, because I think you can take it and you can apply it in a number of different areas in your life. I call it the 3 pathways of emotional expression. But here's how I like to phrase it. I like for you to think about yourself as a child. When you were a child growing up in your home, and you would get upset, and you would express an attitude, you'd roll your eyes, or you'd huff and you'd puff. Was that okay? How many of you could roll your eyes and huff and puff and grunt at your parents and feel like you were going to live to see the next day? Right? What did you usually hear? I will knock those eyeballs into the back of your head. Don't roll your eyes at me. Well, see, that's an attitudinal expression. That we all have 3 pathways through which we express our emotions. Now, a lot of what I've done throughout my career has been challenging an old paradigm of thinking. Your paradigm is the way in which you see the world. It is the lens through which you look at it. And a lot of everything that I've done and that I've taught is a different paradigm. So some of the things that I'm going to share with you this evening are going to be a little challenging to a different paradigm of thinking. So after attitudes, you'll notice these little arrows, they go down. So after attitudes, there are feelings. How many of you as children growing up felt the freedom to express your feelings, to say to your parent, I'm mad at you, or I hate you, or I don't like this food? Right? Anyone? Yeah. Rare. It's a rare occasion. Right? Feelings are the next pathway through which we express our emotions. And I want to help you understand why this is all important in just a little bit. If you can't express through rolling your eyes, if you can't express through your huffing and puffing, you drop down to your feelings. If you can't express through your feelings, you drop down to behaviors. How many of you could freely act out in your homes? Kick holes in the wall, run away, drink beer, smoke cigarettes? Not likely, right? So behaviors become not okay. So if you can't express your emotions through your attitudes, through your feelings, through your behaviors, you drop down to a deeper level. Now let me ask you a question before we go there. Why do you feel like it wasn't okay to express attitudes, feelings, and behaviors? Does anyone know why?
Your parents didn't know how to deal with it.
Well, they didn't know how to deal with it, and what was their message for why it wasn't okay for you to express that way? Disrespect. It's being disrespectful. And if you're being disrespectful, then I am not raising you the right way. And if I'm not raising you the right way, then I am facing not only you being a delinquent adult, juvenile, and later a misfit adult, but I'm facing being a bad parent. Right? So none of us want to face that. So then what happens is when we express attitudes, feelings, or behaviors, it causes us as the parent to become more stressed, your parent, and then to need to suppress that reaction. So your emotions get suppressed, your feelings get suppressed, then your behaviors get suppressed. Well, if you can't express through attitudes, feelings, and behaviors, you have two options. If you can't express through these three, and it's called anger and depression. Those become your only two options for expressing your emotional energy, because that's all an emotion is. An emotion is defined as energy in motion, nothing else. It's just a state of energy. So when you can't express your attitudes, your feelings, and your behaviors through your emotions, through any of those things, then you drop down to two other levels, and that's anger and depression. Those become your only other options. So I call this the trauma triangle. Trauma is any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more. But when you spend any time longer than, say, 6 months in anger and depression, which has to come out through behaviors, that is essentially living in a state of trauma. And that has a different effect on the brain, and we're going to get into that in a moment. So if you can't express through your attitudes, and you can't express through your feelings, and you can't express through your behaviors, then you're only left with anger and depression. In anger, you act outwardly, and in depression, you act inwardly. So the challenge with this is that this becomes a conditioned pattern of operation. We don't just let this go as adults. This doesn't just affect us while we are children. This imprint and this pattern affects us throughout our entire life. In fact, John Bowlby is known as the father of attachment. Attachment is the way in which we communicate and relate and connect to one another. He came up with this theory back in the 50s, and he says the first 3 years of your life establish the blueprints for all of your future relationships. The first 3 years. Now, not many of us spend a lot of time thinking about the first 3 years of our life. But I'm going to ask you to do that for just a moment. For just a moment, I want you to think about, and see, I like to go even further back than just the first 3 years. I like to go all the way back to in utero. What was going on with mom and dad while mom was pregnant with you? What was their relationship like? Where did they live? What were their financial circumstances? Was there war? Was there depression? What was the level of stress that they were dealing with? What were the messages? Because as early as the fourth week after conception, the fetus is capable of hearing. As early as the second trimester, the fetus is capable of psychological processing. So you start receiving messages and imprints in your brain that you will carry with you for the rest of your life while you're in utero. Those are called preverbal memories. Those are the memories that occur and get stored at a level of your brain called the brainstem that gets stored before you can ever say a word. So they are unconscious memories that continue to play out. Those memories can just be received. They can be received from the external environment, from the way people engaged with your mother while she was pregnant with you. They can be received through her. The messages that she sent, the statements she may have sent, the foods that she eats, so on and so forth. So if you think about that, then you start to identify some possibilities for why things keep showing up in your life now, that far back. But I like to say, John Bowlby says the first 3 years of life. I like to say the first 5 years. The first 5 years, because by the 5th year, your brain is 95% completely developed. By the time you're 5 years old, your brain is 95% its maximum size. It's going to grow a little bit further up until you're about 10, but then it's going to start to prune down. So your brain is growing really fast. You have a lot of imprints, a lot of dendrite synapses that are occurring. So when you start looking at health, when you start looking at weight, when you start looking at overall health and sickness and illness and everything else, you start to think back to how you learn to express emotions. Bruce Lipton is a cellular biologist, and he says that 98% of disease and disorder is related to stress in the autonomic nervous system. 98%. 9 times out of 10, any medical, physical condition that you are dealing with is directly connected to stress. And think about that from the perspective of how we learned to express emotions, because it starts up here. Emotions are a reflection of our stress. So when that energy starts in our body and we don't learn to express it, guess what happens? It gets stored in our body. Stephen Covey says, upset feelings never die. They are buried alive and come back as something uglier. Upset feelings never die. They are buried alive and come back as something uglier. So when we don't learn to express through our attitudes, when we don't learn to express through our feelings, through our behaviors, we just bury it. And then we carry those imprints with us throughout our life. So what we have to learn to do is we have to learn to ultimately bypass behaviors. But guess what? If you haven't learned to express any other way, you don't have any other option. You don't have any other alternative initially except to express through behaviors, because you don't know any other alternative. See, we beat ourselves up thinking we should choose some different alternative for communication. We don't know any other alternative for communication, because that's what our brains have been conditioned to do. So we want to just all of a sudden take someone who's acting out behaviors, eating all the time, eating to soothe themselves, or drinking to soothe themselves, or some people work out to soothe themselves. We want those people to all of a sudden stop doing those behaviors and just start communicating. Well, it doesn't happen that easy. You've been doing these things at some level since you were a very small child. So it just doesn't happen overnight, and that's why we have so much yo-yo dieting. Because changing your eating is just one very small component of who you are, without looking at the other things. So you have to learn to be able to start expressing those emotions through your feelings and through your attitudes. It is actually okay to roll your eyes. It is actually okay to huff and puff. It is actually okay to say you're mad. It is okay to cry. It is okay to be frustrated. All right, so what is stress? Stress is any event whether internal or external, which knocks the body out of balance. It's any event. So you can experience stress through any of your sensory pathways. Most of us know about sight, sound, smell, hearing, taste, touch. Those are primary sensory pathways. So you can become stressed by something you see, something you hear, something you smell. You can become stressed by touch. You can also become stressed by temperature. You ever get cold? Get hot? Makes you uncomfortable? That's a sign of stress. So your body's in a state of stress. You can also be stressed by movement. So just movement knocks your body out of balance, and it's constantly requiring your system to try to restore that balance. Another way you can become stressed is digestion. Anyone recently started trying new foods, new eating habits? Affects your digestion. That's stress. But see, stress is not all bad. Stress is necessary for growth. It's necessary for healing. It's when stress exceeds our window of tolerance. We all have a window of tolerance for how much stress we can handle. When the stress exceeds our window of tolerance, that's when we become stressed out. That's when it's not good for us. That's when it starts to break down the body. It can actually break down the brain. We'll talk about that as well. One of my favorite little biblical verses, to give light to those who live in darkness. All these verses have a very specific purpose to this talk. To give light to those who live in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. So let's look at this. We have some very important areas of our brain. And I always call this Brain Science 101 through 401. But it's very simple. And I believe that the more simple, the better, especially when it comes to understanding who we are. This part of your brain called the amygdala, it's also connected to the brainstem, is considered to be a part of your limbic system, also referred to as your reptilian brain. It's the first part of your brain to develop, but it is also the part of your brain that is most responsible for stress. This part of your brain, specifically the amygdala, is the part of your brain responsible for fight or flight. You've heard of that, right? The fight or flight response. Well, there's a third response. I actually don't like to call them responses. I like to refer to them as reactions because they are not conscious. The third is freeze. So there's fight, flight, or freeze, but we only learned about freeze in the last 20 years. But it's actually your first reaction to a stressful event. Anytime you become stressed, the first thing you do is freeze. And then you determine whether to fight or to flee. So that part of your brain happens emotionally, unconsciously. There's no thought involved. This part of your brain does not think. Also remember, this part of your brain is where all those early memories are at. It's where all those early imprints are at. And it is really triggered by sensory activation. So smell is the most direct way to trigger your amygdala. So as soon as you smell something, you ever walked into a room and you smelled something that smelled really good and you went, oh, that smells like grandma's carrot cake. Right? How does your brain go back to that memory so fast? Because smell only has to go through one pathway to hit your brainstem to connect to a memory that could be 30 years old. Just one. Or there's sight. Sight, have you ever noticed you look at something and then you do a double take before you actually see it? Because sight has to go through 7 different pathways in your brain before it becomes a conscious thought, as opposed to smell. Smell is one. So your amygdala is where you have your stress reaction. Anytime you have a stress reaction, it's important to know that your amygdala has this neural circuitry which runs down the spinal cord into the intestines. You have your adrenal glands. You're all familiar with a gut feeling. A gut feeling is not a metaphor, it is a biological reality. The moment your brain perceives a stressful event, it sends signals down to your gut. And it cues your gut for survival. Now, scientists actually say there's a second brain in the gut, and it's actually more evolved than our brain up here because it's just more feeling. It feels more, it's more intuitive. And most of you realize that that first intuitive, that first gut feeling is usually the accurate one. When you're at a stoplight and you say, well, which way should I go, left or right? And you know you should go right, but you go left anyway and you end up having to turn around. That's your gut feeling. That's your gut talking to you. So your amygdala experiences stress. It's just like a radar detector. Do, 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 do. It doesn't think. It's all emotional. Do, do, do. Looking for a stressful event. Any threat. Anything it perceives as a threat, then it reacts. And it releases stress hormones, which go through the pituitary, past the hypothalamus, and it hits the hippocampus. Your hippocampus is the part of your brain that is responsible for short-term memory. So when you're under a great deal of stress, that cortisol over time, when it's uninterrupted, has the ability to damage dendrites in your hippocampus. So when stress is unabated and it's uninterrupted, dendrites in your hippocampus can actually shrink and shrivel. So you think about having short-term memory challenges. It's oftentimes because we're under too much stress. The more stress we're under, the more pressure we're putting on our hippocampus to try to keep up. Then your hippocampus is connected to your orbital frontal cortex, which is a part of your left hemisphere, your frontal brain, but it's important because it is considered to be the executive control center for all your social and emotional relationships. Now, here's what's important about all this. Your amygdala, your fear receptor, completes its development by the time you're 18 months old. 18 months old, you have a fully engaged stress response system. Fully engaged. Your hippocampus doesn't complete its development until you are 36 months old. So it's not until you're 3 years old that you actually begin to have the ability for short-term memory to override your stress reaction. Your orbital frontal cortex, your executive control center for social and emotional functioning, it doesn't complete its development until you are 25 years old. 25 before it is fully online. So we think about all the problems we have with teenagers. There's no wonder, because they only have half a brain, right? We're always expecting teens to act like adults, but they're so far from it. Now here's where this gets important. When you have a stress reaction and it hits the pituitary, it passes another structure in the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases a hormone, and that hormone is called oxytocin. Oxytocin is the brain's anti-stress hormone. It is also referred to as the love hormone, also referred to as the cuddle chemical. But what you need to realize is it's the brain's anti-stress hormone. It is the hormone that combats cortisol. So when you are stressed, the brain is supposed to release oxytocin to help calm you down. But the challenge to that is that oxytocin, unlike cortisol, oxytocin is a learned response in the brain. So in order to release oxytocin adequately in the midst of stress, you must learn it first from your parent. So when you are an infant, and it starts very young, starts even in utero, but specifically when you are an infant and you're in a state of distress, when you're crying for whatever reason, and your parent comes and soothes you, your parent is not just soothing you. What your parent is actually doing is training your brain to release oxytocin. So it's brain training at a very early age. And what it's doing is teaching you that as you get older and you're stressed, you become stressed, release oxytocin. So essentially it's training you that as you get older and you become stressed, take a deep breath. Because by breathing, that's one way you release oxytocin. That's why you calm down when you breathe. When you're really stressed out and someone says, just calm down, take some deep breaths, calm down. It's because it turns on oxytocin. What's another way to turn on oxytocin? Eye contact. Just eye contact turns on oxytocin. Laughter turns on oxytocin. A hug turns on oxytocin. Music turns on oxytocin. But guess what else turns on oxytocin? Food. Food turns on oxytocin. Food makes us feel good, right? And when we've not learned to turn on oxytocin in other ways, by simply breathing, for one, we learn to turn it on in other ways. Smoking turns on oxytocin. Alcohol consumption turns on oxytocin. Everything that makes you feel good turns on oxytocin. The problem is that a lot of the things that make us feel good aren't good for us. So it leads to other issues and other problems. But the reality is if you really want to combat stress, you have to learn to turn on your oxytocin response. And there are a couple things we'll discuss that get into that. So let's look a little closer at how this affects us. So Alan Shore says, he's a neuroscientist at UCLA, he says the core of the self is nonverbal and unconscious, and it lies in patterns of affect regulation. Affect regulation is a very important word, but essentially what this means is it's not what you do or what you say. It's how you feel when you're doing and saying it. It's not what you do, it's not what you say, it's how you feel when you're doing and saying it. Have you ever talked to that person who's smiling at you and you know they really want to strangle you? Right? Because their energy is communicating something different. 90% of communication is nonverbal. 90%. You just know, you just feel when someone doesn't feel good. You just feel when someone's upset. 90%, we can't hide from that. So it all starts with honoring ourselves, honoring where we're at in any given moment. Where are you at emotionally, and just being really honest with that, because that gives you a lot more freedom when you can do that. So two important terms, regulation and dysregulation. I refer to them as light and dark. Regulation is the ability to experience stress and maintain stress within one's window of tolerance. So we all, every single morning when we wake up, we all have a window of tolerance. And we utilize that window of tolerance all day long to help us deal with stress. So as the day wears on, that window of tolerance gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And you notice that come the end of the day, that window of tolerance is pretty small. And guess what a lot of us do? A lot of us get up first thing in the morning and we go to work. And we spend all day long on our window of tolerance, and then we get home, we have the least window of tolerance for the people who matter the most. That's just the nature of our society. What we have to learn to do is recognize when our window of tolerance is getting smaller, and learn to take steps to increase it. How do you increase it? By turning on oxytocin. So what does that mean? It could mean before you even go home, you sit in your car and you listen to your favorite song. Or on your way home, you listen to your favorite song and you take some deep breaths and you let the day go. It could mean that you stop and take a walk at the park. Maybe you go to the Y and you go for a swim. It could mean that you just need some food. Like literally you haven't eaten all day. Food is a very basic, very core component of our survival. So when you have not eaten, when you've gone long periods of time without eating, it sends your brain and your body into stress, which burns up your window of tolerance. So just eating on a regular basis, small things even, keep your body fueled. So regulation, the ability to maintain stress within your window of tolerance. Dysregulation is the experience of stress outside of one's window of tolerance. This is being stressed out. When you are in a state of affect dysregulation, you are stressed out. So when you go to the grocery store and you're hungry, there's a reason why you want all the stuff that's not good for you. Because you are stressed. And sometimes you could be completely stressed out. Now, this is in here because this is, usually the audiences I'm speaking to are therapists and parents and kids, adopted and foster kids. It's believed that affect dysregulation, being stressed out, is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. Being stressed out is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. So if you know someone who's ever been diagnosed, I always say, start by lowering stress. If you are suffering from any condition in your life, the first thing you should do is start lowering stress. But it's such a negatively reinforcing cycle. Why is it a negatively reinforcing cycle? Because stress causes confused and distorted thinking. At a very basic level, I want you to think about that. Why is it that when we are stressed, we end up doing the exact opposite of what's in our best interest? Because in times of stress, we're not thinking clearly. In times of stress, we don't remember. So what do you have to condition yourself to begin doing at a very basic level when you are stressed? Just stop and breathe. You don't have to do tapping. You don't have to sing a song. Just at the most basic level, when you are stressed, stop and breathe. 10 deep breaths. And what that'll do is release oxytocin and allow your thinking to come back online and allow your memory to be activated again. And the more you do it, the more conditioned you get to do it when you're stressed. Your stress model, I'm just going to touch on this real quick. I actually developed this theory 15 years ago, and it's what I've pretty much taught my entire professional career. And it really is a theory of human behavior. It applies, I believe, at all ages to everyone. And it's very basic. It says all behavior, so you can think about any behavior that you may struggle with, arises from a state of stress. In between the behavior and the stress is the presence of a primary emotion. Very important right here. There are only two primary emotions. Only two. Love and fear. Those are our only two primary emotions. Everything else arises from one of those two states. Anger, jealousy, frustration, depression, all of those things arise from fear. So at the most basic level, it's just love and fear. That's it. It's through the expression, the processing, and the understanding of our fear that we can calm our stress and diminish our behaviors. A lot of times what we want to do in our society is we see negative behaviors, we want to focus on negative behaviors. We want to change the behaviors. We want to talk out of the behaviors, or we want to diet our way out of the behaviors, or we want to do any number of things to get out of the behavior. It's not the behavior that's the problem. That's the wrong place to focus your attention. It's the stress underneath it, the messages that are connected to the stress underneath it, which then drive the fear, which then drives the behavior. So if you want to have the greatest impact in any behavior, you don't start at the behavior. You just use the behavior as a signal. The behavior is just like a red flag. The behavior is just telling you something's wrong. But you don't start there. You start at the stress. And remember, we can experience a stress reaction through any of our sensory pathways. So you don't always know what causes you stress. You don't always know what causes your spouse to be upset. They don't know. 90% of the time, it's unconscious. Something deeper, something in our brainstem got triggered by something we just experienced out here. It could have been something you saw driving into the building. It could have just been coming into the building and a certain scent hit your nose a certain way, which triggered you at the brainstem level, which has a memory attached to it. See, we have all our memories. Every memory you've ever experienced and every experience is stored in your brainstem. Every memory. So I'm going to back up for just a minute. Every memory, every experience you've ever had is stored in your brainstem. The brainstem is like a sponge. It just sucks it all up. Now, how you've been able to express through those memories, how you've been able to process them, how you've been able to understand them just moment to moment is what allows them to be stored in it's called a coherent way, in that it gets stored in your cellular system in a very settled way. versus an incoherent way. So when you've had an experience like my father was a Vietnam veteran, severe PTSD, affected him his entire life. But before that, he was raised basically with a father who was an alcoholic. He had 9 other siblings. They had a very rough life. So he had all that in his brainstem. Okay, so then when he came back from Vietnam and he'd get stressed from whatever could have gotten triggered out here, it also taps into the other stuff. Okay, I was adopted. I was adopted as an infant. That experience is still in my brainstem. So when I first started speaking, because one of my core kind of imprints is a fear of rejection, a fear of abandonment. So when I first started speaking, I remember I'd be speaking and someone in the audience would ask a question. And I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck raise up. And it would stimulate a lot of fear, but for me, fear always turned into anger. So there were times when I would really not handle an audience situation very well. Not because of anything the person had said, but because of my own fear of rejection or abandonment. And so it took many years to come to really understand that and come to terms with it and be mindful of it. And so any of those experiences that you've had, and they go all the way back, that has not been expressed, processed, and understood, and stored in a really coherent way, still gets stirred up. So the opposite of that is incoherent. So when you've had an experience that's stressful, which I call trauma, I'll touch on that in just a minute, it gets stored in your body in a very incoherent way. So what you have to understand is that stress is intimately connected to fear. The moment you become stressed, you're scared. The moment you become stressed, every cell, which you have trillions of cells in your body, every cell in your body carries memory. The moment you become stressed, the cells in your body constrict into survival. So do me a favor. Hold up this one hand. Now imagine this is one of the trillions of cells in your body and it has memory attached to it. So when I say stress, I want you to ball your hand into a fist. Stress. That's a cell. When we become stressed, we constrict into survival. Now you are stressed. You are stressed out. Balled up nice and tight, stressed. Ooh, you're so stressed. Now in that state of stress, shake hands with the person next to you. Go ahead, give it a shot. Give it a shot. Huh? It's not so easy, is it? What if you were insistent? Really, shake hands with them. You were banging knuckles, right? That's what we do when we're stressed in our bodies. That's what we do in relationship. It's what happens in relationships at home, relationships at work. It's what happens with relationships with food. It happens in every relationship. When we're stressed, we constrict into survival. And as long as we're constricted into survival, we cannot be in a space of love. We cannot be in a space of openness. You cannot hear, you cannot learn, you cannot thrive, you cannot grow if you are constricted. So every time you become stressed, you move into fear. And fear will dictate everything that you need to do until your brain can calm down long enough to shift into love. Now, what is love? What is love? Love is a space that's all around us. It's always available. At any given moment, any of us can be in a space of love. The only thing that keeps us out of love is fear. It's that simple. It's no more complex than that. Any given moment, we can be in a space of love. And we spend a lot of time as loving people, right? But then a lot of times we shift right into fear. And then a lot of times we shift into fear and we don't even realize it. Why do we not realize it? How many of you may have gotten yelled at by a parent or by a loved one or maybe spanked or something by a loved one, by a parent, and what they say to you? I'm doing this because I love you. That wasn't love. That was fear disguised as love. See, in our society, we don't know what love is. We've spent so much time and we have been so conditioned hearing that love is one thing, when in fact it's something completely different. So when we go through our day-to-day lives, oftentimes we'll go through our day-to-day lives and we're stressed, we're fearful, and we're not in a space of love. And that's the ultimate goal. Because when we can reach that place, then we handle stress differently. In a completely different way. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to holler. Okay, so let's talk about trauma for a minute. Trauma is any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, or unpredictable. And when that event continues on unexpressed, unprocessed, or misunderstood. So when you don't have an opportunity to express, which could be to yell or to cry, when you don't have an opportunity to talk about it with a supportive, a secure person, when you don't have an opportunity to come to some understanding of why it happened, that event will affect you for the rest of your life. Changes your brain. When you're able to express, when you're able to process, when you're able to understand, that's the difference between a short-term stressful event versus a long-term traumatic event. So let's look at some possible traumatic events. I call these traumatic events common with adult regulatory difficulties. So when we have issues with stress, abuse, a lot of times we don't think about abuse. There's physical abuse, there's sexual abuse. We're very familiar with those in most instances. But what about emotional abuse? Emotional abuse is actually the most pervasive form of abuse that exists. Do you know why? Because you can't see it. All you can do is feel it. There's actually a research study done by a researcher named Tiffany Fields, University of Miami. She took two infants. She took one infant that was hooked up to a brain scan. Both infants were hooked up to brain scans. One infant had a healthy parent. The other infant had a depressed parent. The scans of the two infants looked exactly the same when the healthy parent got up and walked away from her baby in comparison to when the depressed parent walked towards her baby. The scans looked exactly the same. What that represents is the power of emotional communication. When you are stressed, you are emotionally absent. When you are depressed, you are emotionally absent. And when you are emotionally absent, all you are communicating to the other person is stress. And remember, 90% of communication is nonverbal. So all you communicate to the other person is stress. Neglect, birth trauma, adoption and foster care, frequent moves, chronic pain, emotional absence, parental depression, domestic violence. These are these are ones that I have commonly dealt with over the years. And in some ways, they're kind of misleading because we make these really big. Like these are really big traumas. These are traumas that you really know about. But what about a car accident? What about the woman like back in the 80s who drank the hot coffee at McDonald's and sued them for millions of dollars and now is living on some island somewhere? But guess what? She may not be able to drink a hot substance again from that one event. I had a lady, she heard me giving a lecture. At the end of the lecture, she came up and she said, "Oh my gosh." She said, "I've been terrified by birds my entire life. My entire life. And it wasn't until you were just talking that I remembered when I was 6 years old, my sister and I were in the backyard playing and I got attacked by a rooster. I got attacked by a rooster. You know, my dad came out, got the rooster off of him, you know, the feathers and everything. But she said, ever since then, I've been terrified by birds." She said, just the other day, and this is a lady who's a social worker, you know, she's a professional woman, works with kids. She said, just the other day, I went out of my house, got in my car, and a bird landed on my hood, and I froze. She said, I begged that bird, please get off my car. That's trauma. That's trauma. It shows up in so many ways that we're not aware because it is any stressful event going to work every day in a stressful environment can be trauma. Any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable. And what do these things have in common? All of these things occur in the context of human relationships. What does that mean? When these events occur in the context of human relationships, the brainstem stores them in a way that says human relationships are not safe. That's what the brain says. Because that's all the brain knows in that moment of activation and stress are these experiences. So then when we become stressed out, bam, all these experiences come back to the forefront and we say, relationship's not safe. 4 levels of memory. How are we doing on time, Scott? Okay, we have four levels of memory. We have cognitive, emotional, motor, and state. Your cognitive level of memory is where you remember your facts, your names, your directions, etc. Underneath that is your emotional memory. Every cognitive memory has an emotional memory attached to it. Every cognitive memory. Have you ever had that experience where you were in Walmart and you saw a person that you worked with like 5 or 10 years ago and you went and hid behind the clothes, right? Because you got an emotional memory attached to it. You know what I'm talking about. Motor memory, that's your walking, your talking, happens automatically. You don't even think about your motor memory. It is 98% unconscious. When you get up in the mornings, you put your jeans on, you put your socks on, you put your shoes on, you don't stop and think about those things. You should. Because that helps you to practice mindfulness. Just pay attention. Just pay attention. But it's unconscious. Underneath that is your state level of memory. Your state level of memory is where your personality traits are stored. So the very essence of who you are is stored at the state level of memory, but guess what else is stored there? Trauma. Trauma is stored at the state level of memory, and when the state level of memory gets activated, it directs all the other levels of memory. So when your state level, that trauma, that fear, that stress gets activated, it affects how you move, it affects how you feel, and it affects how you think. Emotional reactivity is driven from past experience attempting to avoid an old feeling. We run, strike out, yell, or cry. All attempts to avoid our true experience. So I do this exercise, or used to do these exercises in my classes, my trainings, called Breaking the Chains. So I use the scripture as a guidepost. It says, therefore, if your whole body is full of light and no part of it is dark, it will be completely lighted. That's when the light of a lamp shines on you. And the significance there is the darkness lies in the emotions that we have not expressed. So if you think about the past traumas, if you think about the past experiences, if you think about the past stressors, those are all unconscious experiences in your body. Every now and then they come up. But what you don't want is you don't want them to every now and then come up. You want to bring them up consciously. You want to think about them. You want to write about them. You want to talk about them. You want to feel about them. So it's very important that you feel about them, because that is what allows them to become conscious. It is what allows the memory to become more coherent. That way it's not just coming up anytime it wants to. See, a lot of times we think we have control over our emotions, and we don't. Our emotions have control over us. But we don't like those emotions. We don't like those experiences. We don't like those feelings. So guess what we do? We do nothing. We bury it. We suppress it. And then guess what happens when we get stressed? What comes out? Raw! You don't have control over that. But the key is to gain control over it. How can you start gaining control over it? Just think about it. Start writing about it. Realize you're not going to die by facing it. But the more you face it, the more control you'll take back over it. Sheldon Kopp was a psychotherapist in the 70s, and he says, before you can get out of something, you have to be willing to get into it. Remember that. Before you can get out of something, you have to be willing to get into it. And essentially what it does is it creates the difference between emotional flexibility and emotional rigidity. Within your window of tolerance, as long as your window of tolerance is expanded, you have the ability to be emotionally flexible. Someone can be angry with you, you're calm, you're handling it in a decent enough way, you're operating within your window of tolerance, you're flexible. But when your window of tolerance gets really small, you become emotionally rigid. When you become emotionally rigid, you don't have much tolerance for others' emotions. You don't have much tolerance for the way things may be presenting themselves. You don't have much tolerance for change. You don't have much tolerance for anything that moves you outside of your routine. It's because your window of tolerance is very small, therefore it causes you to be very rigid. The goal is to become more flexible, more fluid. One of the ways you do that is by practicing your breathing. Practice your breathing. Some things that you can begin doing. This is a process. It is not an outcome. This is not something you just go and you start doing. It's something that you learn to do over time. There are two ways to change the brain: repetition and emotional impact. Repetition and emotional impact. That's how you change the brain. So positive repetition of supportive, loving environments and emotional impact. So primarily you're going to use repetition. Understanding the dynamic of fear. Understanding how stress and fear play together. Because that's the biggest challenge. Being able to pay attention to your stress and fear in a day-to-day way. Because really this is all about creating more emotional flexibility. Awareness. Being more aware of where you're at and what you're feeling in any given moment. Mindfulness is the ability to slow down and pay attention. To ask yourself a question, to check in with yourself and just say, hey, how am I feeling right now? Where am I at right now? It's mindfulness, and it's a practice. They call it mindfulness practice. Focusing on what you're doing, focusing on the task at hand. It lowers stress. Acknowledging not only your own emotional state. Bryan, you're feeling really stressed right now. Bryan, you're not in a good space. Bryan, walk away. Bryan, take some deep breaths. Bryan, it's going to be okay. Bryan, you're not going to die. Acknowledging the feelings of others. You're really upset, and I get it. You're really stressed out, and I get it. Just acknowledging. Cognitive negative awareness. I like this. Actually, I developed this about 10 years ago. What cognitive negative awareness is essentially instead of positive self-talk, some of you have heard that, I believe in negative self-talk. So when you're already feeling something negative, don't try to overcome it with something positive. When you're feeling something negative, look in the mirror and say it over and over and over again. Just say it. Be with it. Give into it. Just give it all you can. And what you'll find in a very short period of time, you'll stop and you'll say, you're being absolutely ridiculous. And then you can replace it with something positive. So give into the negative. Because a lot of times we just want to bury it. We want to suppress. We are big in suppressing things. Don't suppress. Let it come out. And then seeking resources. What are seeking resources? Project Wellness is a resource. Everyone in here is a resource. Your friends are a resource. Your supportive friends are a resource. Sometimes just stopping and getting your feet on the ground and recognizing your feet on the ground is resourcing your body. So having resources that can support you, especially when you're stressed, become very important. Creating regulation, you must take care of you. Prayer, prayer, and more prayer. We should always be working towards being ever more grateful every day. The more you can practice gratitude, the better you will feel. You've got to get enough rest. If you're not getting enough rest, it's going to directly affect your physiology. It's going to affect your stress. Did you know that prayer actually releases oxytocin? It releases oxytocin. It's been proven. You got to get enough sleep. Lowers your physiology. Increases your window of tolerance. You don't get enough sleep, you wake up, your window of tolerance is very small. Adequate exercise, you have to move your body. Not only does it release toxins, which are stressful to your body, but the actual moving of your body in and of itself releases oxytocin. Helps the fluids move. Adequate nutrition, very, very, very important. You can take Chef Robin's class for that. Decreased external stimulation. I learned to do this when I was a kid. When I'd be in an environment and it would be somewhat noisy, and usually it was like my grandma's house after church on a Sunday. All the family would descend up on my grandmother's house, which was actually smaller than this room. And so you get about 12, 15 people in this little house. And after about 2 hours, I would have to get up and go outside. And sometimes I'd just be ready to go. When you are stressed, one of the most important things you can do is start reducing the sensory pathways. So when you're stressed, stop looking around and start focusing on one area. Start breathing, get into a quiet space. Maybe if you're really stressed, you don't want much touch. See, the reason you get stressed and you don't want to be touched is because touch, anytime you're touching someone's skin, it's as if you are touching their brain. It has that many sensory receptors. So that's why we don't want to be touched. That's how we came up with talk to the hand, right? You don't want to touch, you don't want to make eye contact. You're reducing sensory pathways. And all that helps you to feel more secure. Increase quiet time. Quiet time is very important. It's very important that you make time just to be in the quiet. Increase play. Dr. Tammy is working on a workshop series which is all about fun. All about fun. Increasing your play. Why? What does play do? Releases oxytocin. There are two pathways to attachment. It's not all about attachment. It's not always about reducing stress. Reducing stress is very important, but also increasing joy. You increase joy in your life and you increase oxytocin. Have more fun. Have more fun. And do something that adds meaning. The moment you find one thing in your life that adds meaning, then you're going to be doing something that reduces stress. The power of love. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is patient and love is kind. When we are not being patient, guess where we're not? We're not in love. When we are being unkind, guess what state we're not in? We're not in a state of love. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. And in any given moment, we always have a choice. We always have a choice. We can choose to continue to react from those old messages, those old stories. We can continue to operate from that place that we're not happy with, that we don't want to be. Or in any given moment, every one of us has the opportunity to choose love in any given moment. And that is how you reduce stress. Let us love not in word or speech, but in truth and action. God bless each and every one of you, and thank you for coming.